I'd like to invite our speakers if they're here in the hall. Dr. Nalin Shinghal, Chairman and Managing Director, BHEL, Mr. Nadir Godrej, Chairman and Managing Director, Godrej Industries Limited, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, Dr. Ela Patnaik, Group Chief Economist, Aditya Birla Group, Dr. Rupa Chanda, Director Trade Investment and Innovation Division, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Can we have all the speakers on the desk, please? Moderating this session is Dr. Ajit Ranade, Vice Chancellor, Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. Over to you, sir. Please take the
Thank you,
session
Renuka.
forward.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session. The session is on future of globalization. And we have an excellent panel with different perspectives. So I welcome my panel. Globalization, the sort of, if you want to put a definition to it, globalization is considered to be the free flow of goods and services and capital and ideas and also people. The key word here is free flow. So this is the definition of globalization from a trade or a commercial lens. Of course, we can talk about globalization in the larger context of societal dynamics and interplay of ideas and cultures. But even if we consider a narrower perspective, at least the free flow of goods and services and capital, money, finance, and also importantly, labor. So labor and capital free flow across national boundaries is what we understand by globalization. And the fact is that the nation state, national boundaries itself is a modern concept, not more than perhaps 200 years old or 300 years old. And globalization has seen its heyday. I'm told that actually the degree, if you try to measure it, index of globalization was higher in 1910, before the First World War, than in, say, 1980s. So this is something that is an interesting tidbit. But really, in the modern times, I think we understand globalization to be the increased interplay of commerce and trade, perhaps in the last 20, 25 years. The birth of the World Trade Organization, an international organization committed to the development of, or rather growth of free trade, is WTO, World Trade Organization, which was actually born in 1995. So it's barely, 25 years old. The second largest economy in the world, China, was knocking on the doors of WTO, but they were allowed entry only in 2001. And I think they were given a formal market economy status much later, maybe 10 years later. Even a large country like Russia, which is part of BRICS, came into the WTO much, much later. So in a sense, globalization is fairly recent, I would like to say. But recently, in the last few years, we have been hearing about stories about how there is some tension and there are tendencies to, there are setbacks. I'm reminded when President Trump took over as president, one of the first things he did was slapped steep duties, import duties on the import of material from China. I mean, for the US to slap a duty of 20% or 25% is unprecedented, it's shocking. And then he proceeded to impose duties on many other countries as well. So this was seen as a kind of anti-globalization step, and we can talk about why that happened. Some people feel that he was kind of catering to a domestic political constituency. But the interesting fallout of all that was that the World Economic Forum, which has its annual meetings, I think sometime in January, that year, either it was 2019 or 20, before COVID, one of the keynote speakers was President Xi Jinping of China. Now remember, President Trump slapping duties against Chinese imports because I guess the motivation was A, that you're stealing our jobs, B, that you're indulging in unfair trade practices, and C, that you're stealing our intellectual property. You don't have a adequate intellectual property protection regime, and you're stealing American ideas. So we are going to penalize you. So this is the context. This was the undertext. And one of the keynote speakers in World Economic Forum, which is the congregation of the who's who in the, in the business world, was President Xi Jinping, and he made a very famous speech, saying, effectively saying that China, what are you guys doing, USA? I mean, you guys are putting up protectionist barriers. China is the champion of free trade. So these are the times we live in. That ironically, it was China which was claiming to be the champion of free trade, and it was America which is becoming very protectionist. But I must also remind you, at the height of all this saber rattling, or rather trade tit for tat protectionism, I think 2019 December, before COVID, uh, the Chinese manufacturer or Chinese company delivered a fully built, made in China cruise liner, ocean cruise liner, to America. US China trade was 650 or 700 billion dollars at the height of this saber rattling. So therefore, while you go beyond the rhetoric, the fact is that globalization is very much here to stay, and perhaps there have been some setbacks. But and now, after Ukraine and maybe post COVID, we are seeing a lot of geopolitical realignments. So there's lots of angles to this. So we have the panel, and I'm delighted to welcome them. So what we will do is that each person will speak for about 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes, and I'll request my panelists to be brief and as opening statements, and then we will take the conversation from there. So can I invite Dr. Nadir Godrej to begin? Sure, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Ajit. Globalization comes in waves. It surges high and then it caves. With open minds and open borders under tolerant liberal orders, it naturally tends to thrive. But its very success can then drive a sudden turning of the tide. While the going's good, enjoy the ride. Immigrants and cheap imports make vested interests out of sorts. The benefits we can clearly see, but they apply generally. The problems are here and there, but the few affected really care. The vociferous voice supersedes, the general good one hardly heeds. Globalization goes on for long if institutions are very strong. But as we face greater stress, the global order's in a mess. It is no longer climate change within a tolerable range. A crisis is what it's about, with fires, floods, as well as drought. If we are to succeed, collective action is what we need. As we apportion unequal guilt, our resolve begins to wilt. The pandemic then took its own toll. It was a destabilizing role. There was great suffering and pain and disruption in every supply chain. Our earlier objectives don't apply. Newer mantras is what we try. Not just in time, but just in case. No complex chain, a perfect trace. For a supply chain that's ensuring, we need nearshoring and friendshoring. The Ukraine war made things worse. In this day and age, to see this curse, an unconscionable energy blight, a war with no end in sight. Global growth is very slow. This will affect the trading flow. Everywhere there is stress, but China's in a special mess. China rode out the early waves, but nowadays they are slaves to zero COVID, which makes no sense. How come their thinking is so dense? Who on earth can now rely on any Chinese supply? What other crisis now awaits? Action across the Taiwan Straits? And sanctions add to the stress. For trade, all of this is a mess. Financial flows may also slow. All this will be a body blow. Globalization is bound to slow. But all the same, it's good to know democracies are very strong and autocrats don't last long. Once again, we'll appreciate that globalization can be great. There's bound to be a positive churn, and sanity will then return. And with the eventual turning of the tide, globalization will spread far and wide. Thank you.
I should have I should have prepared the audience for this. I should have warned you or cautioned you or prepared you. So here's my attempt. This is Mr. Nadir Godrej, and he's a poetry sage. So thank you. But I want to pick out that line. He said, zero COVID makes no sense. How can they be so dense? This is a direct frontal attack on the Chinese policy. We'll take you off in the conversation. So the next, I would like to invite Dr. Rupa Chanda. She's a professor from IIM Bangalore, but currently with the United Nations Commission on the Asia Pacific. So over to you. She's online. Dr. Rupa Chanda, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone, and I'm sorry I can't attend in person due to logistical issues. I don't think I can have such beautiful poetry in the way I speak, but let me be much more matter of fact. I'd like to just touch upon four aspects of this issue of future of globalization, and these are all interrelated. The first is about how countries are likely to take the approach towards globalization in terms of their willingness to remain integrated, and Mr. Godrej has kind of touched on that. The second is about the principles that will increasingly shape the future of globalization, considerations that policymakers and businesses will have to keep in mind, and lessons from the recent shocks. The third is about some emerging opportunities as well as structural trends, which will define the course of globalization. And here I pick on two. One is technology and the other is demographics. And finally, something about the framework or perspective, the lens through which globalization may need to be seen increasingly going forward. And it may have to come to a lower level of disaggregation. And I'll come back to that point. So firstly, in terms of how countries are likely to approach globalization, given the current context, we know we've seen deepening polarization, more skepticism about benefits of multilateralism, and the whole outlook is really riddled with uncertainty. A lot of downside risks, which threaten to impede efforts to reduce poverty, broaden access to affordable and clean energy, as well as achieve SDGs. Now, against this backdrop, are countries and businesses going to retreat? No. I think I would agree with my former speakers that they're likely to take a more cautious and calibrated approach to globalization, one which recognizes the benefits and doesn't completely disengage from the global market, but at the same time is also more circumspect about the downsides of globalization. So it might put more emphasis on self-reliance, indigenization of production, reducing reliance on offshore outsourcing, more use of behind the border measures and non-economic objectives to regulate trade flows. But this doesn't mean that you're going to be unleashed, going back, retreating from globalization, contrary to what's feared, because it's just not economically viable given how interconnected production networks are today. But I do see non-tariff measures, mostly in the garb of standards, environmental and other compliance requirements becoming more prevalent in future. And a related development would also be the creation of new alliances and partnerships, often geo-economic, geostrategic in nature, as part of this calibrated globalization strategy. The second point is about what kind of globalization and what are some of the lessons and the key principles that are likely to underpin future globalization. I think increasingly businesses and governments, especially after the pandemic and the Ukraine conflict, are looking at issues of inclusion, resilience, and sustainability. Three important principles. So globalization will clearly have to create opportunities for women, youth, entrepreneurs, MSMEs, disadvantaged groups. Whether it will or not is, of course, a result of policies, but the pandemic has clearly highlighted the vulnerabilities of non-inclusive growth and not having a level playing field for many segments in terms of skills, access to markets, finance, and technology. So if businesses and governments don't consciously embrace this inclusion in their policies and strategies, there's risk of growing divide, and this could cause the backlash and strong retreat that people fear. So opportunities will have to be spread more widely, constraints will have to be addressed to enable wider participation. So one of the main takeaways for governments and businesses post the pandemic is the importance of inclusion and how failure to do so increases their vulnerability to future crises. The second point about the nature of globalization, resilience. And this is not just about diversifying import sources or finding alternate transport routes to avert crises. It's also about finding new export markets and partners through trade agreements, entering cooperation frameworks, diversifying your economy as well as your production basket, leveraging new opportunities, moving into new parts of the value chain, and innovating. So resilience will require to be supported by regulatory and institutional capacity building, lot more efforts in regulatory cooperation, because future issues will be more complex, and that will be needed also to prepare for future crises. And then sustainability is the other principle that should define future globalization. And increasingly, countries and businesses are embracing the concept of a green economy, such as green logistics, climate resilient infrastructure, green financing instruments, green innovation, climate smart trade and investment. More and more businesses are adopting ESG principles in the supply chains and own operations. And private capital is also looking for opportunities in climate mitigation and adaptation. So focus on sustainability will drive changes in trade policies, future agreements. It will lead to greater emphasis on regulations, again, concerning standards and their harmonization, how trade is conducted, what is traded, and the use of sustainability measures to regulate trade. We'll also see more investment flows into sustainable development related sectors for meeting the sustainable development objectives, and new forms of financing that's already happened, impact investment, and the social role of social enterprises is likely to grow. So this will have implications for diffusion of technologies and result in more emphasis on technological innovations for attaining sustainability. Now, the third aspect, which is technology and especially digitalization, we've seen the growth of digital economy and accelerated by the pandemic, as well as the advent of applications like 4IR technologies. This has major implications for future trade flows because it's going to spur the growth in digital trade, particularly in digital services trade. It will also enable digitalization of trade procedures and promote trade facilitation. The world will also see more investment flows, this is already happening, into the digital economy, in new technologies across sectors, which will enhance efficiency and productivity in business operations. This will also allow more countries to participate, of course, conditional on having the requisite infrastructure, skills, innovation ecosystem, and supporting regulatory and business environment. Another very important feature that's likely to emerge because of digitalization and the growth of digital trade is servicification of manufacturing value chains. So the value-added content of trade and its movement more towards services value-added content could increase. Demographics, this is the other important structural shift that I would want to emphasize. It'll really change the locus of consumption and investment demand, as well as production potential. Further globalization in sectors like health, that means migration and mobility will play an increasingly important role because technology cannot completely substitute in some sectors. This will require new arrangements between shortage and surplus countries. There'll also be potentially challenges because of demographic shifts and backlash to that, and Europe will probably face the brunt of this. So this will have to be navigated through innovative cooperation mechanisms between countries and with regional blocs. Finally, the most important point that I want to highlight is the perspective or lens through which we need to see globalization. I think, between the global and the national, the global is unwieldy, the national is insular, there is the regional lens. And I don't say this only because I'm sitting in a regional commission. Increasingly, we're talking about things like regional public goods, regional commons, not always just global commons. This regional lens is becoming important because we're seeing the role of the region and the sub-regions as building blocks for globalization. In the past 2 decades, and especially after the shocks, we've seen the role of the region as a basis for cooperation in times of crises, for addressing many transboundary issues, and for advancing integration even in difficult areas like standards, mobility, data governance, and trade facilitation. So it's being recognized that really between the global and the regional, there are mechanisms and processes that will probably will be the sort of building blocks or will support the globalization process. And SCAP, as I said, we are talking more and more about regional public goods and regional commons, and this is an intermediary between the global and the national. So to sum up, I would say globalization is complex in future, more and more complex, I would say, many factors and dynamics, but I see forces of both fragmentation and convergence playing out, but the basic direction will remain.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rupa. So I hear you say that globalization is inevitable, cautious optimism. And I also heard you say that about inclusion, sustainability, and resilience is something that countries will we'll stand by. I guess those are the three qualities. You also said something about that between the national is insular and global is unwieldy. So regional is where that's the lens we need to look at. I'm not going to ask you a question now, but the word regional immediately brings to my mind regional cooperation, regional comprehensive economic partnership, RCEP. So if regional is so important and that's the lens you emphasized, what should India do about the regional lens? But we'll move on. I'd like to invite Mr. Nalin Shingle, Chairman and Managing Director of BHEL, for his perspective.
Thank you. I don't really have a prepared statement, but I'll just be I'll be very brief. So the two things which I feel will really affect the way globalization will go for the future, and what we have seen in the last couple of years, one, that the virus has shown us national boundaries cannot be. The two forces which have said national boundaries don't exist: the virus and climate change. I think these are the two things which will have a huge effect on the future of globalization. A lot of distortion, a lot of issues have come in with China and with Ukraine. So to my mind, these will, we have heard about the human-centric globalization. I think this is where we are now heading towards, and I see this as an enormous opportunity for India. With our, what was mentioned, our demographic advantages, our manufacturing base. This is and the imperative to diversify global supply chains, technology being made available. These are huge opportunities, and I think going forward, we need to leverage on these opportunities. We need to take forward, and I think G20 is a huge opportunity, which I presume Mr. Chaturvedi is speaking about. So that's a huge opportunity for us. So I think globalization will go ahead. We will look at flattening the world, and it will be a very different globalization from what we have seen so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nalin. I'm tempted to ask you a follow-up questions, so please indulge me. So you said that the virus and climate change are examples which don't recognize national boundaries. And we are talking about globalization, which is actually flow across boundaries, whether it's goods and services and so on. And I heard Dr. Rupa Chandas talk about there will be resistance from the forces of migration and mobility, because when you're crossing borders, especially when it comes to people. So would you care to comment on this just very, very briefly, that on one hand, of course, things like climate change force us to look at things in a very global perspective, but we still have old-fashioned ideas of passports and visas and resistance to migration. So as BHEL is a global player, so I was wondering what's your perspective?
I would say technology takes care of that. Everything is virtual today, so physical barriers have been taken care of. Okay. It's not going to matter.
Yeah, I think Dr. Rupa also said that servicification and digital. So we'll come back to that. I'd like to move on to Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, who wears multiple hats. He is the Director General of RIS, but also the Vice Chairperson of a state-level Niti Aayog, and also the nodal institution for G20, that is T20, right? Not to be confused with the IPL, but Think Tank 20. So he represents, he's the nodal office. So over to you, Dr. Sachin.
Thank you. Thanks, Ajit. Thanks, CII, for this opportunity. I must thank Mr. Nadir Godrej for setting this stage right with his poetry. And then I think both Rupa and Dr. Shingle have captured the details that are needed in terms of understanding the process of globalization. As was mentioned, both deglobalization and globalization are on. But I think I would just make three observations on the process of globalization, and then I would quickly come to the G20 process, which I have been asked to cover. First and foremost, in my view, globalization, what is and we are seeing is of the neoliberal globalization, the globalization that neoliberal fund bank-based structural adjustment program, which triggered in capital movement, human resource movement, etc. It is that which is facing a huge crisis. And this is what is leading to the decoupling that we are seeing in name of deglobalization and many others. And just to support what I'm saying, I digged out this data at RIS, and being a trade research institute, what we have tried to see now in a empirical investigation from 2002 onwards till 2022, we had time series data, and we have tried to see how northern and southern trade is happening. And right now I'm just telling you about parts and components. So what intermediate products are moving from one country to another, how much of that is actually being exchanged. So 2013, in our investigation, we have found is the year in which this turn has happened, where parts and components total export and import of the developing countries of the global south has crossed that of the north. And somebody may say that in global south it is China. So what we have done is also to take China out of this trend. So what we are seeing, and as Ajit was mentioning, our investigation empirical evidence is very clearly showing in 2013 the export of parts and components by developed countries was $1,319.4 billion, and that of developing countries was $1,340.1 billion. And this, if I take China out, the percentage share of the remaining global south is still on rise. So we have this huge data set now. This would be released in form of a paper, and it is absolutely clear that the share of the south with China, without China, with the emerging markets, and within emerging markets, if I take China out, it is on rise. So parts and components is the best indicator to see how interdependence is increasing. And when interdependence is increasing, process of globalization is actually on the rise. It is on integration basis. And this is rise of the global value chains. It is rise of the a power that is bringing all different actors together. So this, I think, is absolutely important for us to note that it is going on. Some of that might be like, for instance, there was a survey done by American Chambers of Commerce and Industry in China, and they found that 83% of the US firms have said that they are not going to leave China. So it's just the remaining ones which are shifting. So we need to understand that process much more deeper, and that's where we find the role of platforms like G20 extremely high. And that's where the role of the institutions is important. With this COVID crisis, 55 countries have knocked at the door of the IMF, and 32 countries of them are needing the support, the financial support for food security. So the faith in globalization, the faith in global institutions, and their performance, I think, are extremely important. As Prime Minister has said very clearly, during India's G20 presidency, 5 priorities are of great importance. And Finance Minister has also articulated similar set of priorities for us. So as you know, in the G20, these 2 tracks, the Sherpa track and the finance track, both are moving fast in terms of consolidating India's position. As Finance Minister has said, the first effort would be to see how we contain the spillover effects. How do we bring in greater coherence in monetary and fiscal policy? So that's going to be one major area that finance track is trying. Strengthening of multilateral institutions is the second one. Third is the recapitalization that is needed of the regional development banks. Fourth is the globalization and taxation. How that work can further be deepened. What are the new areas that may come in? It may also include efforts that are on within IMF for SDR allocation. And of course, the fifth is the debt, the huge debt crisis that is there. So these are the 5 broad finance track related issues. Within the Sherpa track, as has also been highlighted, is in terms of bringing development back on the track. And when we are talking about development, the issues are coming in beyond macroeconomic stability, global tax, and addressing debt crisis. It is trying to bring in ideas and going beyond that in terms of how we address the challenges that are coming in from climate change. Going beyond the COP26 commitments as number one. Number two is, of course, in terms of what kind of initiatives on development measurement are possible. So, can we go beyond GDP as a measurement? Can we have that kind of address brought in? The third is in terms of identifying priorities for Global South, and within Global South, access to capital at low cost, and also dimensions that are important in terms of our ability to provide global solutions. So, this is what India is trying to take forward: digital solutions based on our own experiences and trusteeship towards nature. They are going to be part of this. Within this vertical, the whole idea of life, the lifestyle for planet, the sustainable consumption and production, and also issues which are important in terms of bringing citizen-led development models that India has in last couple of years demonstrated. So some of these would remain a sort of priority, and I think the last line that Mr. Godrej mentioned, I think is something which I found quite striking in terms of and the sanity will then return, and I think this is the time that Indian G20 presidency would certainly facilitate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin. Thank you very much. I'm glad you brought out some interesting statistics. Did you say that the American Chamber of Commerce said 83% of American companies are not willing to leave China? So that's a very remarkable statistic, that despite all the rhetoric, starting with President Trump, continuing with the Biden administration, and this US-China tension, 83% of American companies are not planning to leave China. I'm reminded of a very famous statement by Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, which is probably the most iconic brand in the world. They sell something like $220 billion of sell iPhones within or products within China, and of course manufactured in China. So he said famously that I am in China not because of my market here, and I am in China not because of the low cost of labor. I am in China because I can't find this talent outside. It's a very, very remarkable statement. So we are going to I'm going to request the panel to again keep their answers brief. But before that, of course, we'd like to have an opening statement from our fifth panelist, Dr. Ela Patnaik, who is the Chief Economist with Aditya Birla Group. Dr. Ela.
Thank you, Ajit. So being the last panelist to speak, I have the advantage of saying I agree with the panelists before, and so I don't need to say much. Except, of course, that there is a lot to be said about globalization. And before the panel, when we met, Ajit said that you could talk about either the short term or the long term, and you could talk about the next few months or about 25 years. And I think my role here is to talk about 25 years, because almost everybody else has spoken about the immediate near future. Now, in the immediate context, I completely agree that the virus and the war have shaped the way, as well as the climate imperative, are going to shape the way the world is going to evolve. They're going to shape the way globalization evolves. It's going to shape how energy alliances are remade, new energy alliances with much more focus on renewable energy. I think this question of the future of globalization comes on the table because we've heard a lot of localization demands that have emerged during the pandemic. So many people have asked this question, would there be greater localization? And would that mean that there is less globalization? I think that to some extent, the world will see more localization, to some extent, but that doesn't mean there will be less globalization. So, in other words, if aluminum is, the ore is available. Let me not talk about aluminum because I'm from Aditya Birla, so I should talk about steel perhaps. If the ore is available in a certain area and the rest of the world uses it, And so it has to come from there. So in some the business has to be close to the place where you you take resources out of the ground, while on the other hand, businesses have to be close to their consumers. So those two things will have to continue. I mean, you can't talk about localization in the sense that we can't go into our backyards and start trying to look for resources, metals, minerals that may not be there. So there will be a change in the character of globalization. And we can't say whether it's more or less. It'll definitely be there. The world will remain integrated, but in a different way. The one thing that I thought I should bring to the table here is that the composition of the world's population, its age and its demographics, is going to look very, very different in the next 25 years. And this is where India is going to be a big winner. And we haven't talked about that yet. India is going to have the largest share, nearly half the working population of the world. What does it mean? To just bring to you what it means, let me refer to last week's talk that Powell did at the Fed chairman, US Fed chairman did at Brookings, where he said, almost gave up, one should say, on the labor supply coming back fully into US labor markets. So what's been happening there? He said that about 2 million retirees are not expected to come back into the labor force. The population growth in the US, and that is the labor force growth, has declined, as has, because of COVID, immigration, deaths due to COVID, aging, women not participating because of childcare responsibilities, or a certain emphasis, which, though he didn't talk about it, but there has been a lot of research and enough anecdotal evidence on it, where people are changing their preferences. And when they are older, they don't want to come back into the labor force and keep working. Along with reduction in the working and entering labor force and looking for jobs by old people, at the same time, you're seeing a rise in wages. So 3.5% US wage rise is something we haven't seen before. So that's not isolated to the US. Societies like Europe, US, Japan, including China, are going to see increasing aging. And the one place that will not see increasing aging is India. And I think that is going to be the big change. When I think of the world in 2040, 50, 2047, I think is the sweet point we often talk about, because that's 100 years of our independence. So if I look at the world ahead, the one thing I see is that this is the place where the young are, where the able-bodied, with so many advantages, our advantage of English, our advantage of diversity. And let me just quote Ajit, who was quoting Tim Cook, that I am in, where Tim Cook, he said that I am in China because I don't find these skills elsewhere. All those companies are going to be in India because they're not going to find the skills elsewhere. That's one. The second thing I see is that what COVID has done is that it has increased the pace of digitally delivered services, whether it's diagnostics, accounting, finance. Services actually match very well with the aspirations of the Indian youth. I was reading a survey some time ago, and they asked people, asked young people, what sort of a job are you looking for? And young people are not looking for blue-collared work. They are not saying, so while we talk about increasing the share of manufacturing, labor reforms, higher fire, A, B, C, and D, but young people are not saying, oh, I want to go work in manufacturing. If you ask them, most of them want a white-collar job. So if you look forward, you think of their aspirations, our strengths in, we are increasingly becoming more educated. By 2040, about half of the age group of people between the age of 24 to 35 would be college graduates. And of course, we are working hard on improving college education. So not to say that all those goals are, out there and done, but yes, that's all work in progress. But we will have a very large share of the world's educated, English speaking young population. And that is going to shape the world and what it looks like 20 years, 25 years from today. Thanks.
Thank you, Ila. Thank you. That's a very important perspective Ila gave us, that if you look at slightly longer perspective, the dominant force of India's structural advantages will be very, very, very important. In fact, Ila, you might be aware, there is a recent NBER paper which looks at not just 25 years but beyond. And one of the projections, by the way, is a very remarkable projection. And this is a paper by about 7 or 8 economists, leading economists in the US. They say that 1/3 of the global economy, 33%, will be the Indian economy. It's really a fantastic estimate. It's a paper which was published about a month ago in BER. So I'm going to just ask my panelists very quick 1 minute question, since we are running out of time. So first question, very briefly, Nadir, is China is still the second largest economy, probably going to be biggest, at least temporarily. Can we have a globalization strategy at the national level or at the company level by excluding China?
Yeah, 3 years ago, I would have said absolutely no. But now I would say that it depends on the industry. Even in 2019, we saw that in some industries like agrochemicals, where we were sourcing all our raw materials from China, intermediate chemicals from China, we found that the costs were rising in China because China had stronger environmental laws, China had higher labor costs, and we started developing the technology to make those chemicals ourselves in a just-in-case scenario. And during the pandemic, we did exactly that. Now we are again importing some of them from China, but we are ready to produce them ourselves if we need to. And with China being so unreliable, I expect many people will have second strategies, either do it domestically or source from another country. We also saw that in some industries, Vietnam and Bangladesh were taking over from China. Perhaps Apple will have to wait a long time before finding a source other than China. But in many industries, I think the time is now.
Okay, so to some extent, it's possible to perhaps slightly dealing, but not completely. Dr. Rupa, I'm going to ask you a difficult question, and you can dodge it if you want to, but since you said regional lens, I told you the word regional immediately clicked regional comprehensive economic partnership in my mind. So what do you think should be India's stance? Now you're working for UN, so you can take a neutral view. What should India's stance be with respect to RCEP? That's
Okay,
part of
I think I should.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think I should have avoided it just to be safe. But anyway, I did work on RCEP actually for the Indian government on the services part. So, see, the problem is that India went too gung-ho with its agreements, but didn't really think through what sort of benefits they would bring. There wasn't deep enough analysis. And if you look at RCEP in terms of the nitty-gritty, yes, if you look at commitments, you look at what happens in services, would there be a trade-off? Really, it wouldn't have given us the sort of market access that we were thinking to trade off for what we might be giving up in manufacturing. However, I look at it differently. I think that, we talk in silos regarding trade benefits in these agreements. We don't link it with investment related benefits. And that's where the difficulty is, because RCEP actually would have been a great opportunity to bring in investments into India, to bring in technology, and exactly what we are trying to do with our own policies separately, but it would have given us the integrated production network. So it's an opportunity missed because of a very siloed approach. This would be my simple answer.
Thanks, Rupa. But I think the window of opportunity is still open slightly. So we'll try to prize it open, and you will help us from Bangkok, I hope. So question for Mr. Nalin Shinglal. Since you are a global company, India's growth is dependent on participating in the export market. We cannot grow. There is just no way India is going to grow without significant growth in exports. So what do you think is the prospect for companies like yours in a world which seems to be somewhat, it is globalizing, as Sachin Chaturvedi said, but it seems to be there's, stop and go. So what are the prospects for globalization for companies like you?
I think the prospects are very good. You see, it's not just manufacturing, it's design, engineering capabilities as well. So if you put the entire thing together, design, engineering, manufacturing, then with the sort of resources that BHEL, for example, has, there are huge opportunities, and we are going gung ho on that. There are a number of areas we are looking at going out as a product company rather than as a project company. So that's the strategy we are looking to follow.
But would you participate in projects if the global tenders, okay, World Bank global tenders come up in projects in countries like Iran?
Depending on the level of government support, we could. Being a company.
Please note. Sorry, I'm just being a little mischievous. But I know that there was a time when geopolitical considerations also have to be outweighed with a vis-a-vis prospect. And of course, BHEL is a famous company where their order book, the waiting time is sometimes 5 years or 6 years. So, so I guess you can afford.
We have long cycle orders. Essentially, the order cycles are 4 years, 5 years. Project orders, product orders are much shorter cycle. So and you're talking of Iran. We are in Libya.
The only other company I know which has 5 or 10 years order cycles is Boeing. But anyway, let me ask a question to Ilham. So I think I fully agree with you that if you look at the aging, which is a very important angle, that aging and demographics in the world, India has such a overwhelmingly strong advantage that there's no way that, but I want to ask you, what are the risks to this outlook? Because surely it's not a completely done deal that in 25 years India will be like a big part of the global economy. So there must be some risks. What are the risks?
Yeah, many risks along the way. And we need to do a lot before that potential is achieved. Absolutely not a done deal. The only done deal is that these are young people who have been born and who will be part of the population and who will be part of the working the labor force. Now, would it be, I think, what people call a burden, or would there be a demographic dividend if we are able to get them educated? If they are healthy, then things would look rosy. Otherwise, the same picture could look very bad.
So public investments in health and education.
In health, education, as well as infrastructure. So there are studies showing that roads get teachers and doctors to villages. In addition to that, I mean, there are new issues that have emerged during the war, the questions of energy, renewable energy, clean air, water. I mean, we have a bigger crisis. I think somebody here yesterday, Janmajay Sinha, was making the point that water is one of our biggest issues.
Risks, yeah.
So
there's a climate risk coming from the environment and climate.
Or the way we are using water, giving free water to agriculture, and many issues related to water. So there are a lot of issues related to public policy, both in terms of law. I mean, I would start with law and order, judiciary, the criminal justice system, health, education, the trade policy. We have macro imbalances. I mean, there are so many risks.
Okay. So I mean, there are strong structural advantages, but it's not a automatic or a done deal, because we have to cross these steps of several reforms. So I guess we have totally run out of time. I think the takeaways for me are that globalization is not a choice. In fact, it's an imperative. But how you embrace globalization is important, whether, the kind of policy, you need to make the right kind of policy reforms, or you need to have a kind of a nuanced China strategy. Even during the year of Galwan clash, India's #1 trading partner was China. That was 2020 calendar year. 2021 calendar year, after all those sanctions and all that, the #1 trading partner of India was China by 20% more. And 2022, we are in December, the #1 trading partner of India is still China. That's the reality of globalization. So I thank all my panelists for a great discussion, and thank you to the audience as well for their patience. Thank you.
That could have been a louder round of applause. Can we hear that, please, for everybody on the dais? I'd, I'd like to thank all our esteemed speakers for this session. Thank you very much. And with that, we close this session. The next one will start immediately.